I was gonna say, I'm so envious of your amazing background. Gosh.
I'm in the clouds.
So pro. I'm so like in awe.
Oh, thanks. It's actually been like the one of the funniest things about, like, I've been doing these lives and people like it's like a giant oversized photograph. It's Madison's here. Hey, Madison. People love this thing. And I'm like digging this hat situation.
Oh, thank you. Actually, it's my favorite milliner. Her name's Teresa Folia. She's an incredible magical unicorn. I love her.
I see that. Yeah, I have a friend who's like known for her like hats that she wears, and I'm always envious. She gets these like custom hats made, and I'm just like, she's like a real, like, can pull it off, and it's like a thing. And I feel like that's like a signature to your style too. Like, not only are you this like brilliant, talented entrepreneur, but you have this like signature style also, which is like,
it's really all out of utility and laziness. A jumpsuit, because it's one thing I have to think about. And as you know, with kids, it's just like, I got to get out in 60 seconds or under. And then, helps a bad hair day or unwashed hair. You just,
the braids. Yeah, the braids are like, I'm like, I literally just tie them. I literally just tie them, and that's me done. Like, I'm like, okay, they're tied. They're literally just tied. So that's cool. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
I'm thrilled, and thank you for having me. And I think today, National Voter Registration Day, I feel like this is, good big omens for today.
It is. I should have pinned, so those joining us, I should have pinned, I have a swipe up feature in my stories. If you are not registered today, today's the deadline, and there's like ample opportunity for you to do it. It's literally easy. It's in my stories. Swipe up to register. And it's like, if you're one of those people who's like, I don't know, I haven't done it, like, you can check at vote.org. I think it's vote.gov. And you can check to see if you're registered to vote. You can check where your polling place is. The New York City DMV for the New Yorkers. I know you're not in New York right now, but for New Yorkers, like, you can look through the DMV to check all your voter registration stuff. And I've made it super easy. Literally swipe up. It takes like two minutes. 2 minutes. It's
Vote Save America and I Am a Voter are two other amazing, very digitally native, they make it super simple. Unfortunately, it's so state by state, which is really, I think, something we really have to transform in this country. But yeah, I mean, we have ample notice. What did they say? 5 Tuesdays to the election. And I think it's also important for everyone to vote up and down the ballot. I think, yes, the presidential election is obviously the talk of the town, but the truth is, state and local elections make a big difference on policy and what our lives are like, which I think so many people don't realize. And it also kills me that we are not registered to vote in schools across the country. Like, when you are a senior or of age, if you are in school, your school should be registering you to vote. The amount of 18-year-olds that turn into being voter eligible during this period that don't vote because they aren't registered is actually tremendous. And a lot of times the difference between an election.
That is something I didn't know. So that's really interesting. And that is something that I think could be like a really super cool, like, senior project that could go viral, especially right now with like school being online and like the simplicity of really like pushing that for seniors. It could be like a really, really great,
I don't think you should be able to graduate and not register to vote. I always say it's like we learn so much about obviously important history, but we graduate from school or we're out in the real world as sort of late teens, and you're not taught to balance a checkbook. You don't learn about savings. You don't learn how to vote. You don't learn how to read a ballot. We do not teach enough practical skills in my mind to really make active citizens. It's something you really have to seek out, or your family does it at home. But my mom was obsessed with voting. She walked us through our first ballot. Even now, we're grown adults, and she still calls us and is like, this is the deadline. Have you gotten your absentee ballot? And we're lucky, but that's not most Americans. And like I said, millions and millions are eligible to vote and don't get registered and miss being part of that election. Our voter turnout in this country is important.
It's you would not pass a test with the percentage score, for sure. Like, it's not a passing grade. I actually, an organization that I really love is, have you heard of Vote Forward? They do it. I love what they do. It's obviously like, it's not necessarily something that right now is appropriate, because what they encourage people to do, the thing that I love that they do, is these like sort of like writing parties. A friend of mine, a very civically minded, incredibly talented woman named Annie Hart, she's been like writing letters to Chuck Schumer since she was like a little girl, because her parents are incredibly like civically involved, and she turned me on to Vote Forward. And they actually, I'll show you what they do. They've got, I had a little a party recently, or it wasn't recently, it was before the shutdown, and I have these are all waiting for stamps. They give you these like, they're all dusty because they've been sitting here waiting because it was earlier this year, but they basically give you these form letters. You can print them all off. They provide postage for people who need to register to vote, but these letters are specifically, they're like just letters urging people to vote. They're registered voters who they haven't been voting necessarily, so they have like this database, and they're literally just letters like, and they're nonpartisan. They're just like, I'm voting in this election, and then the people who are doing the letter writing party, they write in their reasons, like why, it's literally just like citizen to citizen urging other people to like vote for whatever their private citizen voting prerogative is, but just to vote, to participate. And that was when I did a couple of letter writing parties earlier this year, and they make it super simple. It's like a kit, you print it off. The thing that you have to do is, for the urging letters, you need postage, but they have kits where it's like people who need to register to vote, like they've moved or it's lapsed or whatever, and they can get re-registered, and those they provide postage for. And I think that I know it's not like an ad. I have no reason. I just love what they're doing. And I think that a barrier can be like, especially, maybe you can relate to this, as a working parent and as somebody who's like, I'm in New York City, you're in LA, like, it's like, go, 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 busy, busy, busy. Like, for me, they just make it so like click, 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 simple. And I just had a bunch of people over and a charcuterie board, and literally just like had pens, and we just like hung out. It was one of my last like parties too before quarantine.
We still talk about we went to a French charity event for our production fund, and we were like, the last time I had someone who was like a stranger, I just miss that so much. No, look, I think it's something you and I, Sharon, have talked about previously, is I think every person has to do something. And I think we all have to get over that mental block of, I'm just a person, I'm just one person, what do I matter, what do I care? We all can do something. And look, we have sub 50% voter turnout in this country. That's not a democracy, right? We're not represented if that's what's happening. So I think for every person just to do something, we even talked, I'd never spoken to a lawmaker before March 16th. In fact, I actually hate I don't mind cold calling weirdly for business, but like personal and as myself, I feel very nervous, which my team always laughs.
Yeah.
I'm very nervous. I don't know what the business is. I'm like, whatever, they can say no. Personally, I'm like, I don't want to be rejected. But once you start taking one step towards something that you care about, and to your point, I believe in it, whatever. You can be bipartisan. It's not about a party. This is about us actually being represented as a country. And I always say, my husband laughs at me, but I'm like, everyone should be taxed if they don't vote. Like, there should be some sort of, you lose a privilege if you don't participate or show proof that you tried. It's just sad. I hate seeing those numbers. It just feels like whatever the results, that's just not what this was designed to do.
Yeah, and it's difficult. There are people who like have genuine access issues, right? So like there is all this sort of like historical context and all of these sort of like privilege and racial things wrapped up in this like accessibility issue. And like for me, when you're talking about small acts of service, like for me, what I can do is I live in a massive building, like me making sure, like checking that my elderly neighbors who I know have mobility issues are like I have a car, that's a resource that I have and a privilege that I have. So I can check on my neighbors and say like, hey, do you want to go to the polling station? Like, are you good? Do you have a way to get there and back? Like, and all of those things, checking on my actual literal neighbors in my building, of which there are many. There's a lot of elderly folks who live in my building, a lot of people who lived here for decades, and really making sure that I'm, as a citizen, you know, utilizing my resources to like help my neighbor, my literal neighbor. You know, we kind of jumped in, and I feel like we could like do a little maybe intro.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Camilla Marcus.
Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell me
Sure.
who you are.
Camilla Marcus. I guess chef, entrepreneur, and activist is probably the, I think it was Hannah Bronfman who called it a multi-hyphenate for the first time. At least that's when I heard it. So I told her, I'm stealing your word. I think it's the greatest brand. And yeah, I mean, look, I think I row a lot of different boats at once. Very passionate about, you know, what hospitality can do for our communities and what food and beverage can do to improve us as humans and help us be more connected and sort of help our neighbors. And we do that through a lot of different lenses. I'm very passionate about environmental issues and how food and the food supply system obviously is connected drastically to climate change, how, you know, hospitality is the second largest private employer in the country next to healthcare, and, you know, really helping us solidify a place in really our country, in people's minds and in lawmakers' minds, as to really how important we are as that employment agent, and what the industry can be reformed, hopefully, and changed, especially post-COVID, to really, really do good, do better. You know, I always say, this is always my tagline, you know, we make more decisions about food and beverage in our daily lives than almost anything else. And what if we could put a little bit more consciousness behind that? Think about how improved our lives would be, how we pay it forward, and how that can really have a ripple effect. So now I find myself, I think, you know, COVID kind of snapped me into an advocacy role in a way that, you know, I laugh. My husband wanted to get into politics when we were younger, and I was like, I'm not a politician's wife. I don't think that that's going to work for me. And he's like, that's so funny, because now you're really in it. You know, I think crisis always triggers us into being sort of our best or worst selves. And I think for me, you know, going gets rough and I get going hardcore. And I think it was just, you know, I got to do something. And so I've helped found one of the co-founders of the Independent Restaurant Coalition, as well as Relief Opportunities for All Restaurants, which sort of works very similar to the IRC in New York State, and, you know, trying to fight for the survival and the sustainability going forward for the restaurant industry, for independent restaurants specifically. And yeah, you know, I think, as we said, I really believe in the power of one person's passion and one person's drive to make a real difference, and hopefully inspire others to do, as you said, whatever's in their power, whatever tool they have in their toolbox, to really use it to its fullest extent. Yeah,
I mean, your background, surprisingly, this part was surprising to me, because I have followed your career, like you know, the childcare situation, which we're gonna get into, but, you know, going back before that, and your restaurant and the things that you have been working in the last several years, you studied law, and like most, like the thing that's kind of like the full circle is you've got a bill right now called the Restaurants Act. Tell me and tell the people who are watching, like, tell us about that, and tell us, like, what's going on, how do we participate, how do we, like, do what we need to do to keep that moving. So talk to us about that, to explain what it is, and then.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I really, really empathize with everyone and what we're facing right now in a post-COVID world, no matter who you are, where you are, how old you are, what your situation is. I mean, right when I graduated college, I went to culinary school, and in the midst of that was the financial crisis of '08. And, you know, almost all my friends ended up without a job. You know, everyone felt very sort of boat without a paddle. And I hid out in graduate school. I just sort of, you know, I wasn't gifted knowing exactly what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do when I grew up. I still tell my team, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. Just kind of, you know, writing it as we go, playing jazz, if you will. So I ended up going to get a JD MBA and really hide out until, like, the economy and opportunities came back. And ironically, it's paid off big time. I mean, a lot of advocacy obviously revolves around understanding both the legal system and the government system, which obviously are intertwined. So the IRC was really formed to get financial aid to independent restaurants. So what had happened was airlines got a bailout almost immediately, which is ironic because they haven't been shut down. They've been operating since the start. And we employ more people in New York than airlines do nationwide. And it's been 6 months and we have not received industry-specific aid. In fact, restaurants, hospitality generally received 8% of PPP funds. And actually there's $120 billion left in the PPP program that's been unused. What? And that's actually the exact dollar amount that we're asking for in the Restaurants Act. So the IRC, in partnership with, it's a bipartisan, bicameral act in both the House and the Senate. And the Restaurants Act calls for $120 billion in aid to independent restaurants, but it also tiers. So female and minority-owned businesses get a first application, and then it sort of goes through so that it's prioritizing those that have the least likely access to capital and flows through that way, which obviously was a big flaw in PPP. And the idea is that it's meant to be much more of a bridge for a longer-term problem. You know, I said it from the start, PPP is a 6-week fix for an 18-month problem, which is what restaurants are facing. So if you go to saverestaurants.com, there's all these ways that you can help. You can donate to support our efforts. They have auto email fillers for all your representatives. You know, there's still quite a lot of people. We're almost 200 in the House and I think 42 in the Senate that have agreed to sponsor lobby. You would be amazed how much constituency can move people. We've seen people give us a hard no and switch a couple weeks later when we've sort of put the full court press. This is a human issue. 11 million people are employed in restaurants, 16 million if you look at our supply chain. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, that's a human issue. You know, our food supply and restaurants touch every aspect of American life. And without them, we aren't our communities as we know them today. And really 6 months in, the fact that it hasn't passed yet is pretty egregious. So, you know, this is the time really for the public to rise up and again, push their representatives to represent their interests. So if you go to saverestaurants.com, honestly, they make it so easy. You can pull your representatives' numbers and call them, harass them. I always said if everyone took 5 minutes of their day at the start of the morning and got 10 friends to do the same, and we really hammered phone lines, you'd really see a change.
That's great. So I'll link that. I'll put it in my link tree and we can talk about that too. And it's really, I think that one of the things that, you know, that you guys as an organization really like organizing ways for people to engage that make that pathway super simple is super important, because a lot of people find the political process or engaging with their, you know, calling their representatives, like they find it a difficult or oblique process where they're like, but I just literally call that? Like that is a thing that, you know, I think a lot of people, when you don't have that sort of background or that agency, a lot of people are just like, yeah, but I got to deal with the kids' Zoom and like, what do I do? Maybe it's this whole thing and then I'm going to be on, like, what's the deal? And I think that
it's actually really quicker than you think. You can even leave a voicemail. You can send those emails. I mean, again, one drop isn't going to necessarily make a difference. But again, if it becomes a groundswell, you know, this is also an election year. Remember, most people are up for re-election. So a lot of seats are up for grabs. And I think this is a year where an election year makes it trickier, but they also are listening to their constituency because, you know, there's much more at stake than in a typical year. So yeah, I mean, look, it's not very long. Most often they're not just keeping you on hold. You can leave a message. Like I said, you can easily do the auto-populate email. If you auto sent that email every morning, like think about it. At some point, if everyone did that, that would be a big difference.
Do you have any tips for people who are like, I'm going to do that and I'm going to leave a voicemail? Like what, if there's like 2 or 3 things that you should say in your voicemail, or if you get somebody on the phone, like what are the 2 or 3 things? Like 1 thing, 2 things people should say.
The script, we have scripts on the website too. It's very easy. The goal is really to like spoon feed it. It's your name and address, reminding them that you're in their district. You know, saying that you want them to pass the Restaurants Act. 11 million people are employed in independent restaurants across the country, depend on them. You know, we have not received aid in 6 months. 1 in 4 people right now unemployed are in the restaurant business. You know, that is staggering. And I think that alone are great facts to leave on a voicemail and a very simple ask, which is co-sponsor it. It takes nothing off your back. And you can remind them that the amount in the PPP program left over is the exact amount we're asking for. I think that's a sign.
You know, it's interesting too, because there's this whole romanticization of coal miners in this country about being like what represents America. And at the peak in like 1923, when it was like the peak employment of coal miners, there was only 863,000 coal miners in this country, compared to currently 11 million, did you say? 11
and by the way, that figure is about how many people work in restaurants in New York State alone, one state. And we're not the biggest state.
Right. And so, you know, this idea of like, what is America? This idea of like, what's worth, you know, like putting our resources behind, what's worth saving. I mean, even if, you know, as you're describing, it's a human issue, even if you like aren't with that and you're some type of ghoul, like it's an economic issue that I'm serious. Like, what if you're like, yeah, but I don't care about people. Like, what about the economy? Because for some reason, you know, people are out there and they don't clock that like people and the economy go together.
Well, and economically, you're talking about trillions of dollars that we represent. Again, 16 million people in our supply chain. We also reinvest 90% of income back into the economy, unlike other businesses. The ROI is there on this, you know, investment. And we keep saying we're looking for a relief bill. It's not a bailout because we didn't cause this. We have done bailouts for so many industries every single decade, time and time again. Airlines, you know, the financial services. I mean, there are so many big industries that have been bailed out, no questions asked, right off the top. There's a platform for it. There's an example of it. And the irony is most of them were involved in what caused, you know, their demise, if you will, and the need for financial support from the federal government. And yet here's a situation where we didn't cause any of this. I keep saying it's almost like eminent domain. The government has taken our businesses since March, but there's no just compensation. There's nothing in return. We haven't gotten a bailout. We haven't gotten relief. We haven't gotten really a restructuring plan from any level of government for an industry that's been taken. You know, we didn't do anything. We're in the business of health and safety, and we want to be supportive of obviously public health, but I keep saying it's like, imagine if I took your paycheck. I've now taken all of your income, except your kids have to go to the same school. You cannot move. You must pay the same rent. You pay the same utilities. You know, if you have childcare, you still have to pay for it. It's essentially what's happening. There's almost nothing that we can cut from expenses for the most part. And, you know, most of our income has been totally taken in the name of public health with no plan or no remedy, which just seems, you know, when you think about it in those individual terms, it just seems totally irrational.
Yeah, I mean, and for a lot of people, that is what's happened. I mean, they have had their paychecks taken from them. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like fractals. It really is just like mirrored. And it's interesting. I wonder what your take then too, like how the new protocols in terms of like opening up for 25%, like what's your take on that? Because to me, that smacks of something where you're talking about like, well, there hasn't been sort of a relief, you know, package passed. And to me, that sort of smacks of like, it's like a setup where it feels like, where they're like, well, you're open. You can have people in your restaurant. So what's the, you know, like, what's the problem is kind of what, when that first came down the pipeline, that's where my mind immediately went, was there, it's sort of like a setup. So, and also like, it's wonderful for people who are like desperate to open or like trying to pivot and like maybe do delivery, which we know isn't necessarily going to work out for everyone. Some people it does, some people it doesn't. But what is your take on the 25% capacity for restaurants? So,
well, even go back. I mean, in March, it was interesting. I was sort of in the minority, but I was pushing really hard for actually a legal shutdown, because what happened was we were shut down, but we were technically allowed to do takeout and delivery. And so really, when you're talking about, you know, your business really being taken over, technically that didn't happen. And every lawmaker we spoke to in March was like, yeah, but you know, you're doing takeout and delivery, everything's fine. And I'm like, well, it's sort of like taking off one of your appendages and being like, everything's fine. Like, it's not really, you know, and you gave us 1 day notice after telling us to eat out 48 hours before, then you shut everything down. And not to mention, our teams have to take the subway to work. We live on top of each other in New York. It's the most expensive place to do business. It's the most expensive place to live. And our restaurants are small, and we're really not built for a COVID world. We're not like an indoor outdoor city, right? Like, we don't have that many months of great weather. So I think originally, I think it comes down to there has not been a holistic plan, and there has not been someone sitting down and tasked with, hey, the restaurant industry, yes, we might be a collection of small businesses, but collectively, we are not a small business. And we need to stop being looped in with this larger bucket of small businesses, because we're being harmed in a very specific way with a very specific demographic of employees and teams, and we're going to be the longest to recover. So the issue with the 25%, look, I see it as a net positive, and we pushed at Roar very hard for it because you know, the governor and the mayor were saying 2021, and we said, look, while outdoor dining is still possible, it may not benefit everyone, but if it benefits even some, it's sort of like, you got to save anyone you can with any measures you can, short of having a real plan, which we've been hoping for and pushing for and offering help in crafting. Short of that, you got to throw everything you can at the problem, right? What's the difference? We might as well get some data. Those that are small will not, you can't cover the fixed cost of opening the door with 25% capacity. If you're a larger restaurant, you can probably make some of it work, especially coupled with outdoor dining, and that was the theory. And we were even asked, well, what do you think between the two? I said, well, sort of like asking which of your children you're going to save. You know, some are going to benefit from outdoor dining, some won't. You know, Westbourne was a great example. We could only have 2 tables outside. You can't open for 2 tables. Again, the fixed cost of opening the door isn't going to be justified. So to us, I think it's something, and it at least opens the door for data to hopefully then increase capacity. The question then really becomes, what are the safety protocols? What's the cost associated with it? Is the dining public ready? You know, it's very hard. I mean, I empathize also with, frankly, New Yorkers too. You know, we've been told it's safe, it's not safe. It's safe, it's not safe. And so I think a lot of people also aren't necessarily ready and don't know who to believe, right? You know, you hear government officials who are supposed to be read into all, you know, all details and all facts of public health and safety. And one day they're saying June 2021, and then they're saying, okay, it's open on September 30th. I know a lot of the public, I know a lot of guests sort of feel, I don't know, you know, what changed in that one day and why. And I think the rhetoric has been also a very big issue in all of this. We've said it from the start, you know, to all the offices, you gotta be thoughtful about what you say. We have, you know, millions of people in New York reading and listening, and that's going to inform what they do. And all of these businesses hinge on that, right? You know, we're in the business of public service and taking care of the public. So you can't just say those things in a vacuum and think that they don't matter. They do drastically. So I think the other challenge with indoor dining, in my opinion, is, you know, public confidence. And like I said too, you know, how it's less than clear how you comply, how you do it safely, who pays, and, you know, all of this, even outdoor dining, came with a very big cost. It's not free to put a setup outside, you know, and these are businesses who have been bleeding cash since March. So, you know, I also keep saying, look, it's a gorge. Not one element's going to fill it. We're way past that point. We're 6 months in. Every little measure is sort of like putting sand in a huge trench. I'll take any sand I can. Why would you argue over a grain? But it's not nearly what's necessary, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's, you know, speaking of New York, it's such a massive part of our culture. And I know for me as a chef and as somebody who lives here, that's like my socializing, right? Like I don't really, like I don't drink, I don't really go to bars, but I go to restaurants and I go to my friends, you know, other chefs pop-ups, and, you know, most of my friends are like chefs or other people in the industry. And you know, being able to go and I did when everything sort of opened for outdoor dining, I was like, as you're describing, it was like, I was there and it was I remember going for a friend's birthday in August and it was like outdoor and it was in the West Village and it was sort of like, okay, we're all out here and it's open air and also like, are we supposed, like, this feels so strange. And I, you know, it's reading articles about people like not wanting to post on social media because there's all this fear and just this unknown. And I really take your point about really, you know, the language that's chosen and sort of the directives that are given. And even things are so confusing. I did a pop-up at Mizanyaki during the pandemic and I chose not to open the restaurant, even though that was an option, because I wanted to keep it as takeaway so that my staff were protected a little bit more and, you know, just to kind of keep everything, because I didn't know. That was part of it. I was like, I don't really know what to think. And, you know, that there was some legislation that changed. It was right around the time when the booze for takeaway kind of like swapped around a little bit. And I remember the advice came out this day and it was like, okay, as of this day, you can't, like, you have to serve like X, Y, and Z with food.
Yeah.
And it was sort of this, and it was reading it and it was like, okay, this says this, but I need to have this other document to be able to interpret this. And then this document hinges on this thing that's also changed. So, and it was sort of this like loop of just like, well, are we selling booze or are we not selling, you know, like, are we selling stuff to go or not? And it was so confusing. And it was like, and you're going to get a fine, but we're also just trying to like limp through because, you know, it was a pop-up because this restaurant had been closed and there's so much confusion and the lack of clarity. And I, you know, it's.
Well, even the last SLA extension, I believe Governor Cuomo reinstated it. So he's been doing it every 30 days, despite us begging them, you know, again, we're 6 months in and no end in sight. I think we could do like 3-month extensions at a time so people could plan their beverage inventory accordingly. Like, you can't move cases of wine like that or not legally. And he actually reinstated it the day, I think it was like 2 days after it had expired. So technically everyone was in violation for 2 days. And by the way, it's like a 15-20K fine. It's no joke.
Right.
So to your point, look, I do have a law background and I still struggle with some of these regulations. And I say to them all the time, I should be able to read this. The average person should be able to read this. Like, what is happening? And again, it's, you know, I keep saying it's like being on a high-speed train trying to fix the engine and the axle where you might be hitting the mountain, but you might go through a tunnel and it's very unclear. And oh, by the way, like, the train tracks might be legal, it might not be legal tomorrow. You might have to switch to a plane and like maybe a boat while you're at it. And by the way, you have multiple people who are both passengers and operating the train who are asking like what's going to happen in 2 weeks to their life. And you're kind of going, I honestly don't know. So, you know, that's our life right now. So it's, look, and I totally agree. I think with all of this, we're so far off the mark of what an appropriate, strategic, thoughtful responses and collaboration with the government to a real recovery. Unfortunately, 6 months in, being still so sort of hand to mouth and, like you said, sort of day to day feels, 6 months in feels kind of crazy. And you add to that, you know, I still think that we have to appreciate the inches even though we're miles off. And I don't know, it's sort of the optimist in me, and some of our board members are like, it's so annoying when you say that. Like, I know it's true, but it's irritating. And I said, I totally get it. You can be angry about the miles and sort of bite your nose to spite your face to some extent, but I still think fighting for the inches while we really push hard on the miles is important. And I do think the indoor dining thing is sort of part of that. Look, so is the temporary surcharge in New York City. It's the only city, all of New York State, it's legal to have a surcharge. All other industries are allowed to have a surcharge. Why restaurants can't and why not in New York City just doesn't make any logical sense to me. You know, you go to a hotel, how many extra charges are there? I mean, it's absurd. There's like 20 charges for different things. No one ever looks at that. I mean, it's silly, but we, you know, it just is sort of like part of doing it. And look, as you know too, I mean, most people when they leave a tip think that everyone on the team shares in it equally. And that's just so far from the truth. Right. So I think, to me, one of the, I guess, silver linings, it's sad, but some of the silver linings of this is I do think the public has become much more aware of our industry, what goes into being in it, what people sacrifice to take care of others, what it costs, what it means, and what's at stake. And I do think that that's a positive.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I think that having a situation where, you know, as you were saying, like when things are important, you fight for them. And it's like when it comes into high relief that, you know, you don't actually know. It's sort of, you know, your train analogy really was just like, yeah, that is, that's really kind of spot on, because, you know, the truth is we never knew. Like it's only an illusion that we know what's going to happen in life and all these things. And then, you know, but this moment's bringing it into high relief. And I think that it's really like, it is a silver lining, and it is a blessing. Like it is giving, you know, some people, and, you know, fortunately people who have energy and resources like yourself, it's like they're moving into this space to create results that they wouldn't have been, you know, sort of ushered in to do before. And we just don't know what's gonna, like, one thing leads to another, and we don't know where it's gonna go when things kind of carry on and move on. And I mean, but you've been working at these things for so long. I really want to touch on the child care situation. The child care situation I remember reading that and just being like, holy shit, out loud to myself when I read about this project you were working on. So for the people who are here with us who don't have any concept of what I'm describing, please share, because this to me, I just think it's incredible. And I don't know how it hasn't happened before. And please share.
Yeah, so I keep calling it the sleeping giant, and I felt similarly. So I'll flash back to about 6 months into opening Westbourne a couple of years ago. We had amazing single mothers on our team who really struggled to get to work on time, really struggled with call outs. They were people who we totally wanted, you know, to groom internally for management, and just so high potential. And, you know, myself and our head of people and culture, Yvette, sat down together and we're like, what do we do? I mean, they can't get dependable childcare. Mm-hmm. The hours don't work. You know, we can be flexible to some extent, but you can't make special schedules for some people. I mean, it's just not fair to the rest of the team. Like, what can we do? So we started embarking on a massive research project of what's available. You know, again, New York, greatest city in the world, arguably, and, you know, should have the most resources, right? So we said, all right, like, what's possible? You know, it's Manhattan, New York City, you know, all boroughs, like there's got to be something out there. And lo and behold, really hospitality. And then as we were going through this, we ended up talking to a lot of nurses and doctors and hospitals, and they have a similar issue because they're shift culture like we are, and their hours are very off, right? It's not a 9-to-5 corporate desk job where you can like leave, come back, you know, you're in service, right? They're in service of health, we're in service of hospitality. And realizing that we have been categorically shut out of most childcare offerings that exist in our major city. Everything is 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and there's no adjustment. Well,
can I pause and say 11 million people in this country are categorically shut out of childcare. Like that's like, let's stop and like take that in.
And by the way, Google Bright Horizons, go look at their stock price. I mean, you're talking about businesses that also have the money to do something creative. Again, if it was a very, you know, I can understand if it was a business that didn't have any margin to do it, but they do. And there is just no offering that adjusts to our business. So we both sort of said, this cannot be. I mean, I'm shocked. I had the same response. Like, I said, 1 million people work in restaurants in New York State that cannot get dependable childcare in a professional sense, who have to depend on an uncle, a cousin, a mom, who have their own lives, right? You know, their job is not to take care of your children full time, you know, and the other challenge coupled with that is when you think about in our business, the highest value service is night and weekends. Events, you know, special things on the weekend brunch. I mean, those are the times where people are able to make the most too. And especially when you're going into management, your hours get even funkier and even more demanding. So again, if you need childcare, you're really also categorically blocked out of high performing, high potential, higher earning positions in this industry, which also sucks. So we just became determined to figure something out. I mean, I think both of us just got really irate. And ironically, at the time, I was not pregnant. I did not have my child. He was not even a thought. You know, neither of us, it wasn't like, a lot of people now, because I have a child, are like, oh, I get why you did that. I said, actually, I was just pissed for other people. Like, I don't like things that don't make sense. And I don't like people being shut out of something that I think is a base need. So we ended up through, actually Dana Cowan connected us to someone with the city who heard of this startup called Vivi Early Learning. And when we met, I realized that the co-founder and I actually went to college together. And we didn't know, you know, we hadn't been in touch, and it was just sort of this weird, I sort of said, look, if this isn't kismet, like through these random connections, and we went to college together, and he's really dedicated his life to childhood development. And I sort of painted the picture for them, and they said, wow, you're so right. And we never realized it, right? Like, you go into this industry and everyone does it the same way. And we were lucky. They were willing to reevaluate and look at their programming to do extended nights and weekends and extended hours. So 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. Obviously with COVID, everything's sort of up in the air. But the other irony is I actually had my son emergency C-section a month early. The day that we announced, you know, the Vivi program and sort of this new thinking around childcare, and everyone's like, oh, you timed that, this is perfect. I'm like, actually anything but perfect. Anyone who's had a C-section, come call me and tell me how much you like don't want to be on the phone with someone while you're, you know, being operated on. But it really, you know, it is amazing how many people can't fathom problems unless they're in it themselves. And, you know, like you were saying, even with the Restaurants Act, you know, I don't care whether you ever worked in a restaurant, you've definitely dined out. And to me, I don't really care whether you're a parent who needs childcare. If you understand the importance of children and the importance of family, you know, this should be a no-brainer and not a problem that we close our eyes to. And I think the bigger challenge in this country is, you know, I was actually talking to Senator Gillibrand's office because they're really talking a lot about parental leave. And I said, the truth is parental leave is actually the second issue. Mm-hmm. Everyone is ignoring childcare, but you can't get parental leave. You can't get health insurance unless you keep your job. Mm-hmm. Health insurance is connected to employment in this country for the most part. So without childcare, you can't keep your job and you can't avail yourself of any of those benefits. And if you can't come back to work, you're not going to be able to take your parental leave, or the parental leave won't matter much because you won't have a job on the other side of it. So ironically, I'm pretty disappointed that the conversation in this country actually doesn't take that into consideration. And I think the problem is very misunderstood because childcare is actually more important than all of those things that have become, you know, the splashy headlines in the last couple of years. Obviously, health insurance was first. Now it's sort of parental leaves coming into focus, but I'll be damned if childcare isn't inching its way up. And that's one of my big missions because I think it's so critical. And I think it is so unfortunately outside of our grasp right now. And look, I'm lucky. I don't have, you know, I'm not a single parent. I don't have to depend on a childcare center. But I would say the vast majority of Americans do, and especially in our industry. And when I heard all these hospitals saying, oh yeah, us too, I thought, wow, now you've got the two largest private employers in the country who are totally shut out of the system. I mean, that's just baffling and wrong.
It is wrong. And I am a single parent, so I have two kids, and I definitely, and we've talked about this previously, it is absolutely shaped my career path, like this sort of access to childcare. I'm divorced, I'm a co-parent. I am very fortunate that I have a co-parent who I have a great relationship with. We have resources, he has a flexible schedule, and I still stress about childcare, right? Like even with all of my privileges and resources, like childcare, I'm like, it's my number one thing. You know, even just like while we're on this live, my nanny was texting me like, I gotta go, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no. And you know, it's like the dad, like, I am very fortunate and I have a nanny. You know, it's like some people can't even, they don't have access to that. And the fact that there just isn't even access. And I think to your point, like I think that these are issues that are so nonpartisan that really can help, I think, our country embrace this change that I really feel like we're ready for. I feel like there is a spiritual evolution and revolution that's coming in this country. And I think that like issues like this and bills and sort of and legislation like this can really be the thing. You know, it's like a no-brainer. A lot of people have a lot of sort of like political clashing about this, that, and the other thing, but it's like, well, let's start with kids and access for childcare for people to work.
But that said, I mean, first and foremost, what you said I think is super important, and people really need to realize, if you look at the numbers, so I wrote this piece for Food and Wine all about this issue, but the numbers are staggering. It actually is a luxury to have childcare. It's a luxury to work. Most people pay way more in childcare than they earn because childcare is so expensive and prohibitive in this country. So first, I mean, and I even have friends from college who, when they had kids, they're like, I have to work. I said, have you done the numbers? Because you should do the math. You will never, I mean, as an entry level working parent, until you get to a certain level, it actually does not make sense to work financially. But what you're hoping is that you then work and earn into a higher level where it does. Better for the economy, better for our society, better for our families, and better for yourself if you are someone who wants to work. Mm-hmm. But the choice of taking care of your child or showing up for work is an impossible choice, and one that no one will make. You know, there's no way you choose anything over your family and your child, but that's what the position we're putting people in every day, which is horrific. The only issue I do think that is a little bit partisan is it does disproportionately affect women. That's not to say it's not a parent issue, it is, but of most couples, it's the mom who stays home. It's the mom who gives up a job. It's the mom who chooses not to take that shift. So it is a little bit, I think, tied to, you know, women's independence and women's rights. I do think it's a parent issue. I think it's a human issue, but I do think it gets spun a little bit the other way. But I'm with you. I think that it would pay, you know, multiples fold, I think, to have parents have the freedom to advance themselves, to advance their families, to push themselves into, you know, higher earning and fulfilling themselves, and not have to feel like you're choosing your child or yourself or your greater family. You know, they're just impossible choices, and it seems solvable. So it's very frustrating to see, you know, that it just hasn't even been, I mean, you Google this issue, it is so not written about. And in fact, I actually pitched a lot of outlets, big news outlets, to talk about the issue, and no one would pick it up. So I decided to write it myself.
That's always the way. I mean, that's
sad. New York, I mean, you're talking about millions of people who are affected by childcare, and no one wants to do a report on it. I mean, it's pretty depressing.
You said that, and I just I didn't even have anything to say. I'm like, wow. And I always have something to say. Like, wow. How is okay, Eater, Vice, who's out, you know, what?
Well, Amanda Cohen ended up writing
is a champion of
Amanda Clute. Sorry. I talk to Amanda Cohen. I talk to Amanda Cohen every morning at IRC, so I always tell her any Amanda in my mind is Amanda Cohen right now, because we see each other every morning. Amanda Clute wrote an amazing piece, and she obviously, I think, has been such an outspoken advocate for parents in this industry, which, look, I mean, aside from the larger childcare issue, I mean, we talked about being moms, you know, it's a very tough industry to be a parent, to be a mom in. It just is. Physically, emotionally, it's incredibly difficult. And I think there's a lot of this, you know, idealization around sort of martyrdom in our industry, especially as chefs, especially as owners. Like, people want to see you 24/7. It's like, okay, well, how is that person supposed to have a young child? How are you supposed to recover, you know, from C-section? I don't know how you go back to work, you know, in 2 weeks when you've had major abdominal surgery, or, you know, want to take care of your young child. I mean,
or sleep.
And the problems only get more complicated, right? Bigger kids, bigger problems.
Yeah. You know, for me, I was in a situation where I stayed at home I was a stay-at-home parent for 6 years, and it really, like, going back into the workforce, even going to pastry school was just like such a stressful situation, because it was like my kids were really little and they're older now. Like my older kid can like walk home, pick up the little one, they can come to the apartment, they can be here for a couple hours, it's fine. You know, like I'm in a totally different boat. But, you know, for people to have freedom, like true freedom, right? Like true freedom to make choices that make sense for them and for their families. Like you got to give people options for sure. We have 10 minutes. We've been talking for 50 minutes already. I wonder if anybody has any questions. But I think somebody's
I know you posted. Did anyone write in any questions?
Nobody wrote any questions that I
Everyone's registering to vote.
Everyone's busy registering to vote if they haven't already. Yeah, it's really easy. For those who weren't there at the beginning, it's 2 minutes. I have it in my stories. Swipe up. It's really easy. It takes 2 minutes. Super fast, super easy. So you're on the West Coast at the moment, though.
Seeing family. So my parents are older and we hadn't seen them for almost 6 months. I mean, I keep saying my poor son, for really most of his life, he's about to turn 1, has been basically in captivity and like very little social interaction.
I know very many babies who have like not seen people that are like Jenny Goodman. I saw her relatively recently. We had like a socially distant outside upstate.
I know. I love the Sophia Rowe.
And
I love the collab.
Yes,
it's so
cool. Listen,
I love
don't even get me
Sophia.
started on that. We had dinner and it was like she's got 2 littles and her littlest little, she was like, this baby has basically seen me and her sister and her dad, and that's kind of it. And
I'm pretty sure our kids are very close in age. Her youngest and my son are very close in age, and I'm actually convinced that they're the last playmate that like either of them ever interacted was each other. And they were like infants, so we like put them on the floor and pretended they were best friends, but they probably didn't even know, you know, what the animate object next to them was. And after that I was like, wow, so sad. I just don't know when he'll have, you know, a proper play date again. So, you know, it's hard to be away. Look, I think for all families, this has also been so hard to have, you know, I grew up, my grandma lived with me my whole life. And so grandparents and that, you know, relationship is so important. And, you know, it was heartbreaking. You know, we did videos, we have a photo stream, we did FaceTime, but it's just, it's not the same. So
yeah, it's
interesting. Letting them rebond has been wonderful.
It's same. So we've just tried to stay connected with technology, and you know, I'm actually working on a short documentary about food and community and the way that, you know, food and community connects people. And it's really, you know, it centers around a Black farmer in the rural South and what he grows food and basically just like brings it. He's 76 and he refers to like the older folks in the community. He's like, you got to take care of the older folks in the community. I'm like, you're 76. But, you know, we interview this woman. She's 105 years old. He brings her food. You know, he grows food. He's had 2 jobs in his life. He was in the Army and then he worked for the post office. He has like saved all his money that he's ever earned basically. And he's like got some great pensions and he's just chilling being a farmer. And what he does is he spends his time feeding people, like bringing them produce. He brings them vegetables and he has cows too. And so he brings them meat and he brings them veggies and he visits with them. And the ways that we stay connected are like all those kind of like supply lines are just absolutely like, I spoke to him earlier this week. They had a hurricane down there. And I'm like, how are you doing? And, you know, he's just like, well, like, he's Mr. Like, everybody's fine. Everything is fine. But, you know, finding those ways to stay connected, especially when you're talking about people who live, you know, in rural situations and people who, you know, like, don't have a lot of opportunity to kind of, you know, somebody who's, you know, elderly isn't trying to go visit with anybody at this point. So there's a lot to cope with. And
well, I think food's a big vessel for that. I mean, I think even I remember early in quarantine, so we were in our apartment for 12 weeks. You know, my son was young and no one knew how, you know, COVID was affecting anyone. And a friend of mine from LA sent me sort of a food care package and I was just like crying, you know, over the granola and the tea. And I'm like, this is just, you know, like I feel you here. And, Yeah, I mean, I think to your point too, I keep calling 2020 such a reckoning. And I think what you said was so powerful and true. It's so much about what we value, who we value. And I think, taking the time, just like taking the time to harass your lawmakers, take the time to make sure that you're calling that person that you miss, sending them a letter, sending them, a bag of granola from your favorite restaurant, whatever have you. I think those little touches, I feel like we're almost going back in time in how you stay connected and show your love when you can't hug and touch and see one another. I think that, those little acts of kindness are now going such a long way, and I think mean so much to people.
I agree. So in the last couple minutes, calls to action. I'm going to put a link in my bio for the resources we've mentioned earlier, right? So we've got that coming. We can call our representatives. We've got all the information for people to just easy. Today's registration day. Swipe up to register to vote.
And vote.
And vote.
Up and down the ballot.
And if you need a ride from your neighbor, ask them or offer your neighbors rides. Check in on the people who live in your building. Check in on the people who live in your hood. If they need a ride or whatever, if you arrange transportation or arrange childcare, if somebody needs their kid watched so they can go vote,
yes.
Watch somebody's kid if you can be social distant, wear your mask, help each other.
And I think you said something very powerful. I think the other call to action is do something. Do something. Everyone has something to give. Yeah. Everyone has something to offer. Big, small, in between. There's always something that we can do. There's always something that we have that someone else doesn't. This is the time to be generous, to be community oriented, and again, to believe in the power of one, that you can do something to make an impact on someone every single day. You just have to choose it.
I agree. Awesome. I want to say
this was so wonderful.
Thank you. Maybe in 2022 we can have dinner.
I would love it.
Perhaps summer 2021. I'm now taking reservations for summer 2021 picnics. I don't know. But
I'm
this is fabulous.
We'll have to collaborate somehow. I would love it. And honestly, I think it was Kwame who said he doesn't want to open a restaurant until he can hug someone. And I was like, that's all I miss, is just, my team knows I'm such a hugger. If you came into the restaurant, even if you were a stranger, I hugged you. It was probably inappropriate and so not professional. But
I'm such a hugger. I'm a total hugger.
I'm such a toucher. It's totally my love language. And I miss that so much. And I think, again, so much of what we do as chefs and entrepreneurs is want to collaborate, want to be together, want to convene. And God, I'm just dreaming of those days again. That to me is what it means to be human. So I'm with you. Whenever reservations open, I'm there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone who joined. I'm going to save this so people can rewatch and get the resources and all that good stuff. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. And I guess I'll see you guys on the next face to face. All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.